The wind howled low through the mountain pass, stirring the dust and ash of a town long gripped by fear. The streets of Lahoud's camp lay deathly still, no birds, no voices, only the tense silence of men waiting to kill or die. But then came the sound, distant yet unmistakable, the slow, deliberate clop of a single horse. From behind a wall of fog and falling snow, a lone figure emerged, black hat, long coat, silent as the grave. The preacher was back. Clint Eastwood's face, shadowed by the brim of his hat, betrayed nothing. No fear, no rage, only quiet resolve. The townsfolk dared not breathe as they watched him dismount. Every outlaw in Lahoud's crew knew something had changed. The hunted was now the hunter. 6 men stood armed, scattered across rooftops, behind barrels and in alleyways, surrounding the bank and the general store. They'd been paid to kill, paid to protect the greed of a corrupt tycoon. But now their hands trembled on their triggers. Because Preacher wasn't just a man. He was a warning, a reckoning. Some said he was a ghost. Others, a vengeful spirit. But all agreed, you didn't survive crossing him. And as Clint Eastwood stepped onto the wooden walkway, spurs clinking softly with every step, he didn't run or speak. He simply looked ahead, with eyes like cold steel, and vanished into the general store's front door, like a shadow returning to darkness. The final standoff had begun. Inside the dim interior of the general store, dust hung in the air like the breath of forgotten prayers. Preacher moved with a calm precision, his boots landing silently on the wooden floorboards, every motion calculated and purposeful. Outside, the hired guns of Lahoud's mining empire were spreading out, watching windows, scanning shadows. Their orders were simple: shoot on sight. But none of them had truly faced a man like Clint Eastwood's preacher. He wasn't a lawman. He wasn't an outlaw. He was something between life and death, and every man who met his gaze felt it, that strange, heavy stillness, like standing on the edge of a cliff in total silence before the rocks give way beneath your feet. The leader of the gunmen, Marshal Stockburn, a cold, sharp-eyed killer dressed in black, narrowed his eyes as he surveyed the buildings. He had faced hundreds of men. He had buried most of them. But when he heard that one slow step on the store's wooden porch, even he paused. There was something eerily familiar in the cadence of that step, something that made the back of his neck stiffen. Then came the first shot. A sharp crack pierced the silence, echoing through the camp like a thunderclap in a canyon. One of Stockburn's men collapsed from a rooftop, his rifle clattering uselessly beside him. No one saw where the shot had come from. It was as if the shadows had fired. The remaining men tensed, calling out to each other, but their voices cracked with fear. Preacher was moving now, not like a man in a shootout, but like a spirit haunting his prey. He didn't rush. He didn't yell. He just moved from cover to cover, appearing only in brief flashes, behind a chimney, between barrels, through broken boards. Another shot rang out, then another. Each bullet seemed to carry justice with it, cutting through the hired muscle like whispers of judgment. Panic spread. These weren't just mercenaries, they were seasoned gunmen. But they were dying like amateurs, because Preacher wasn't playing their game. He was rewriting the rules. Stockburn barked orders, trying to regain control, but even his voice lacked its usual authority. There was a presence here he couldn't explain. A man he swore he had killed years ago in another time, another town, and yet here he was, alive, walking the streets like a ghost come to settle old debts. Stockburn's hand hovered near his revolver, eyes scanning the shadows. But even as he tried to steel himself, a thought crept in, uninvited and unwelcome. The snowfall grew heavier now, blanketing the wooden buildings of Lahoud's camp in a thick white silence. It should have muffled the tension, buried it under nature's hush, but instead it made every sound sharper, more dangerous. The creak of a floorboard, the snap of a branch, the hiss of breath between clenched teeth. The remaining gunmen moved like hunted animals, wide-eyed and jumpy, their formation shattered, their bravado burned away in the cold. One by one, they tried to reposition, fanning out across alleys and behind carts, but Clint Eastwood's preacher was already ahead of them. He didn't hunt like a man, he hunted like time itself, inevitable and merciless. Another figure dropped, a clean shot through the chest. Then another, taken out from behind without a sound. Panic fully consumed the rest. Men who once sneered with cruelty were now trembling in fear, shouting for each other in desperation. But the town offered no answers. Only shadows. Only judgment. Stockburn, still standing with 3 of his men, clenched his jaw as his past came creeping back like a whisper from the grave. He remembered that day, long ago, when he and his deputies had gunned down a man who wore a collar and carried no name, a man of peace who stood in their way. They had laughed after the bullets flew, certain that justice would never come for them. But now, standing in the street with snow falling all around him, Stockburn could feel it, the weight of those bullets returning, carried by the hand of a man he thought buried. From the fog at the edge of the livery, preacher emerged again. Slowly, calmly, his coat billowed behind him as if the wind itself parted to let him through. His revolver hung low at his side like it belonged there, as natural as breath, as sure as fate. The last few gunmen froze, uncertain if they were seeing a man or something beyond human. One of them fired wildly, the shot exploding harmlessly into a post. Preacher didn't flinch. He simply raised his weapon and dropped the man in a single, deliberate motion, quick, clean, final. And then it was just Stockburn. The aging marshal stepped forward alone now, facing the preacher across the empty, snow-covered street. The look in Clint Eastwood's eyes was unreadable. Not anger, not vengeance, something deeper, like a memory wearing skin. Stockburn's voice cracked as he finally spoke, his fingers twitching near his holster. "Who are you?" But preacher said nothing. He simply looked at him with a stare as heavy as eternity. And in that moment, Stockburn knew. He wasn't facing a man. He was facing the reckoning for every sin he thought the earth had swallowed. The grave had spat him back out, and now it was Stockburn's turn to feel its weight. Snow crunched underfoot as Stockburn stepped into the open, the wind swirling around his long coat like the coils of a tightening noose. The preacher stood 30 feet away, motionless, half shrouded in falling flakes, his black hat casting a deeper shadow over eyes already forged from steel. It was the kind of silence that didn't just settle. It pressed down, like the weight of judgment, heavy on the chest and cold in the bones. The street between them stretched like a trial ground, and both men knew the outcome would not be decided by luck or skill, but by fate, long delayed. Clint Eastwood's preacher slowly lowered his chin, his eyes locked onto Stockburn, not with hate, not even with rage, just purpose, a calm, crushing certainty. Stockburn's breath quickened, the past flooding in, those eyes, that face, the figure they had once left broken in blood and dust. It was him, the man they buried under gunfire, the man who shouldn't be standing. And yet here he was, alive, or at least something close to it, wearing the cloth of a preacher, but delivering the wrath of a ghost. Stockburn's hand twitched. Preacher didn't move. Stockburn's fingers reached for his revolver. Still, Preacher didn't move. And then the marshal drew. In one thunderous blur, Stockburn's gun cleared leather, but Preacher was already moving. His draw was a whisper in the wind, smooth as falling snow, and the first shot tore through Stockburn's shoulder before the man could even pull the trigger. He spun, staggered, but Preacher wasn't done. A second shot drove him backward. A third dropped him to one knee. And the fourth, a final, quiet echo, ended it. Stockburn collapsed in the street, his revolver sliding from his hand, useless. The preacher stood still again, lowering his gun with the slow grace of a man who never missed, never rushed, and never celebrated. Around him, the town remained frozen in awe. Windows creaked open, men and women peered from doorways. The nightmare was over. The ghost had delivered his justice. For a long moment, Preacher remained where he was, the snow gathering gently on his shoulders. Then, without a word, he turned his back to the corpse, his eyes ahead. He walked toward the stables where his pale horse waited, not once looking back, because his work was done. And ghosts don't linger where justice has been served. The snow had stopped. In the hush that followed, only the faint creak of wood and the quiet gasps of onlookers broke the stillness. Bodies lay in the street, some covered in snow, others too fresh for the frost to touch. Justice had come not like a storm, but like a shadow, precise and silent, leaving behind a town forever changed. Clint Eastwood's preacher stood at the edge of town, beside his pale horse. He moved with the same grace and silence that had defined his every step since arriving in La Houde. His coat, now dusted with snow and ash, fluttered gently as he adjusted the saddle, never speaking a word. His hands, weathered but steady, moved like those of a man long used to the weight of consequence. Behind him, the townspeople began to emerge fully now, tentatively, reverently. Megan, the young girl who had prayed for a miracle, stood by the general store, her eyes wide, her heart pounding. She watched as Preacher mounted his horse, as if she could stop him with a look, with a word. But she didn't call out. She knew. Everyone did. He wasn't staying. He was never meant to. Hall Barrett, the miner who had once tried to stand up to the thugs alone, stepped forward and removed his hat, holding it against his chest in silent thanks. His lips parted as if to speak, but again no words came. Because what could you say to a man who might not even be a man? Who might be the spirit of justice, sent to balance a scale no court dared to touch? Preacher gave a final glance toward the town, toward the people who would rebuild now, who would no longer live in fear. And then, with a subtle nudge of his heels, the pale horse turned, and together they rode off toward the horizon. No fanfare, no last words, just the sound of hooves growing softer in the snow, until even that was gone. He left no trail, no name, only a memory. And as Megan whispered a final goodbye, her breath turning to mist in the cold air, the townsfolk understood what had truly passed through their lives. Not a man, not a gunfighter, but a reckoning. A ghost in the form of Clint Eastwood, a preacher of justice riding beneath a pale sky. And so the legend grew, of a silent rider who came with the snow and vanished with the wind.